Hi folks, time to assess my reading during November. But let me start before we get into the ranking with two that I didn't quite finish. I had Off Planet, which was a collection of short stories by Clifford Simak, and I felt really rushed at the very end of the month to get through these. I read the two shortest ones and I completely forget what they were about. I wasn't really paying attention. I was just focusing on trying to finish the damn thing. In the end, I decided to put it to one side and I will pick it up another time. So let's not call it a DNF, let's call it a deferral. And then on the last day of November, the 30th, I started The Martian Race by Gregory Benford, which was on my TBR for the month, and I didn't quite finish it. In fact, I finished it today. I'm recording this on Monday, the 2nd of December. So that will appear in December's wrap-up, since that's when I finished it. First up was Moving Target by Elizabeth Moon. This is the second book in the Vatta's War sequence. I think there are 5 books in total. And in this series, we follow Kai Vatta, and she's the daughter of a senior executive in the Vatta Family Corporation, and their business is interstellar trade. It becomes very clear at the beginning of this book that someone very powerful has it in for the Vatta family. And the book begins very explosively, leaving Kai as one of the very few remaining Vattas. And she's at significant risk herself. The book follows her as she and her crew dodge various attempts on her life. I liked the Kai Vatta character in the first book, and we get more of the same smarts, thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead as in the first book. She's pretty young and inexperienced, but she's learning fast as she goes. She shows superior leadership and calmness under pressure, and she relishes in the fight, making alliances as she goes. I've been enjoying her progress as she begins the process of rebuilding the Vatta Corporation and her reputation. So Moving Target's a fun read. It's hardly groundbreaking, but if you enjoy Honor Harrington or the Vorkosigan saga, then I think this is a series that you might also like. I give Moving Target by Elizabeth Moon a solid 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next was Natural History by Justina Robson. It's my first Justina Robson book, and we're several hundred years in the future. There are your basic humans, the so-called unevolved, and then there are the forged, who are genetically engineered or constructed, purpose-built to meet the needs of a particular environment or role, or both. But the forged are getting organised. They're agitating for succession from the Gaia Sol regime, ideally looking for a planet of their own. Voyager, Lone Star, Isol is one of the forged. She's a human starship, and she's on a long-range exploration mission. And while she's out there, she collides with a debris storm, which also contains a lump of stuff, so-called stuff, capital S, a physical 4-dimensional manifestation of something called 11-dimensional geometry. Stuff adapts to wish and will, and Isol incorporates this into her body to become a new engine capable of instantaneous interstellar travel. And then on her way back, she finds a planet which is now devoid of life but exhibiting strange properties. Might this be a suitable home for the forged independence movement? There are some fantastic descriptions of weird and wonderful forged beings, all human at their core, but in dramatically varying forms. Some earthbound, some in space, some living in gas giants, some purpose-built or grown for terraforming or for space transport. Can an enormous forged space freighter retain its humanity? Is such a construct destined forever to be a space freighter? Is there a free will in such an existence? Natural history is space opera, but it's organic, it's biological, it's unusual and inventive. It reminded me of Mortal Remains by Christopher Evans and of Perdido Street Station to an extent, just in terms of the descriptions of the forged in their many varied and weird forms. I enjoyed it, and I understand that there's a sequel, Living Next Door to the God of Love, which I'm now very interested to read. I give Natural History 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next is The Money-Coloured Land by Julian May, which I must admit I long thought was fantasy, just judging by the cover. It looks like a fancy standard issue 1980s fantasy cover, doesn't it? But it turns out it's very much science fiction. Maybe it's at the lighter end of science fiction, but science fiction nonetheless. We are in the 22nd century, and aliens have staged an intervention in our darker years. And humanity is now part of something called the galactic milieu, and our footprint is now hundreds of colony planets. There's telepathy of sorts, mind control and telekinesis are apparently latent powers that some humans have developed with a little help from our alien friends. But in this new colonial galactic world, many humans hark back to simpler, perhaps more challenging times, less coddled, less easy. Handily for them all. In rural France, there's a portal back to the Pliocene epoch, 6 million years ago. But there's a catch. It's a one-way journey. And in this first book of what is a 4-book series, we get a long period, maybe a third, perhaps even a half of the book, just introducing us to the many and varied characters. And that was a bit long and drawn out, and there's a lot of them. And some of them don't even feature in the second part of the book. I think they must rock up in one of the later books. But anyway, it does finally get down to business. And at the point in time that these guys go down the portal, there have already been decades of time travellers, and no one knows what awaits them on the other end of the portal. It turns out much more than they or anyone else bargained for. I did enjoy the descriptions of the flora and fauna, the megafauna, I should really say, in the Pliocene era. And there were plenty of the characters that I liked. And knowing nothing of the plot, I was kind of equally surprised by what they found in the Pliocene. And I enjoyed the basic thrust of the plot thread, the various alliances and the feudal society that they find with a difference. I listened to this on audiobook, and as far as I can tell, the other 3 are not available on audiobook on Audible or elsewhere. So I'm not sure how soon I'll read on to the others, which I do have on my shelves. I'm not in a huge hurry. So whilst there were elements that I enjoyed, overall I give The Many-Coloured Land 6 out of 10. Is therefore a nebulous narrative. Next was The Man in the Maze by Robert Silverberg. I have high expectations when it comes to Robert Silverberg. I've read a few of his books and I've, generally speaking, really enjoyed them. This one didn't quite measure up, unfortunately. We follow Frank Muller is the sole inhabitant of the planet Lemnos, and he's living in a complex and deadly labyrinth, the maze of the title. And he's been there for 9 years, and he knows the maze and its many traps and dangers pretty well. Quite why he's been there for 9 years, we don't immediately know, but the book does gradually reveal that. And it also reveals why he's needed once more for yet another risky encounter with even higher stakes. But they've got to get to him first to persuade him to come out. And a party of other humans lands on the planet, and they try to get into the labyrinth. And with very free expenditure of drones and not a small amount of men, Muller is finally reached. The person that's designated to speak to him is a guy called Ned Rawlings, and he's a young, quite idealistic man, and he's the son of an old friend of Muller's. And it's Ned that's tasked with persuading him to come out by any means, fair or foul. So as I said, this isn't my favourite Silverberg so far by any means, but I enjoyed it up to a point. I did like the interactions between Rawlings and Muller, and Rawlings' discomfort with having to lie to Muller to persuade him to come out. And I did enjoy the various gradual reveals that Silverberg kind of drip feeds us as the book progresses. Muller has an affliction, the nature of which again is revealed as the book goes on. I thought that was interesting, and of course it's Silverberg, so the prose is pretty good. But I thought it was light on the plot elements, and basically not a lot really happens. As a result, I give The Man in the Maze 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure, and I'm probably giving it an extra point just because it's Robert Silverberg. Next is Why Call Them Back from Heaven by Clifford Simak, of course, where some distance in the future, I forget how far exactly, and a corporation called the Forever Centre owns the world, and it owns the world and much of its riches off the back of a promise of immortality. At the end of our first life, we're frozen on the promise by the Forever Centre of later being defrosted and given back our youth again and again and living effectively immortally. And the Forever Centre has accumulated its wealth on the back of that promise. Everyone, pretty much anyway, in the world is obsessed with saving and investing enough to support their future long lives. And if you thought that saving for retirement in this life was a chore, you ain't seen nothing yet. As a result, the majority of the people in this book's lives are diminished, they're curtailed, kind of squished down, depressed, compressed in favour of the long game, the promised future. The Forever Centre has a lot of power and a lot to lose, and it is ruthless in protecting it. Justice is prompt and immediate and implacable, and judges are helped by AI lawyers. Dan Frost is an executive at the Forever Centre, and he inadvertently, completely by accident, finds that he's now a threat to the Forever Centre. He knows something that he didn't ought to know, and he's convicted of some trumped up charge and ostracised as a punishment. He's branded on his forehead and on his cheeks, and he's isolated, and he's reduced to begging and theft in this modern world to survive. But there is help available from some unexpected sources. I enjoyed the contrasting takes on immortality from the corporate and the religious perspectives, which are both examined in this book. And I enjoyed the way that Simak has us all living minimal, hard lives, just on the promise, much like the church of old, of immortal life. I really enjoyed Frost's journey, the people that he meets along the way, the holies, who are the resistance of the peace. And I enjoyed the suggestions that the proverbial emperor might not be wearing any clothes, and the implications of that, and what might happen if the Forever Centre actually started to defrost people. And despite all of that and the obvious flaws in the process, everyone still falls for it, happy to be credulous, happy to live on the promise of that immortal life. I liked Why Call Them Back from Heaven, and I enjoyed it more than I did the Silverberg, somewhat to my surprise. I give Why Call Them Back from Heaven 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next, I read Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And I've only read one Octavia Butler book before this, that was Kindred, and I enjoyed it and her style of writing. And Parable of the Sower was no different, really. This is a tale of things falling gradually and then very rapidly apart. Lauren Olamina is the protagonist. She's 15 years old at the start of the book. The background music is of the severe impacts of climate change, shocking wealth inequality, and the corporate greed that goes with it. In spite of all that, Lauren lives in a pretty sweet suburban cul-de-sac neighbourhood, which the residents have walled off. It's in a town about 20 miles north of Los Angeles. The neighbourhood's mostly black, some Hispanic, and a smattering of white folks. And it's relatively well off, certainly compared to the people outside the walls. Due to a drug addiction of her mother's, Lauren has a condition called hyperempathy, by which she experiences the pain and pleasure, but it's mostly pain, of other people. And that becomes a factor as the book progresses. Outside the walls, it's extremely dangerous. And the people in the neighbourhood venture out as little as they can. They go out for work in one or two cases. They go out for target practice in others. But generally speaking, they stick to their neighbourhood. Slightly disconcertingly, Parable of the Sower begins in late 2024, about now in our time. And Lauren is frustrated that her community can't see how this is all going to end. To her, it's obvious. She foresees that eventually, it's probably sooner rather than later, the outside will come in, taking what they have and possibly killing them in the process. She's strongly advocating for preparing, for prepping, for gathering food and belongings so that they can grab them and go. But people just don't take any notice of her. She's just a kid. What does she know? She's also busy formulating ideas that form the basis of a philosophy, of a religion in future times. And that's called Earthseed. As time goes on, it gets wilder and wilder outside. There are incursions, robberies, and even deaths. And there's a crescendo of violence, and most of the neighbourhood is scattered, and some of them are forced to run. And most of the book then follows Lauren and her small group of people that grows as the book progresses, as they journey north in search of safety and sanctuary. Octavia Butler does a fantastic job of painting in pretty vivid colours the nature of the fall. As we go, we get a bit of slavery, we get roving gangs of drugged up arsonists, we get shootouts, we even get a little bit of cannibalism. It's every man for himself or every woman for themselves, except when it's not. So one of the nice things is that Lauren and her group gradually begin to trust other people, and they seek shelter together and the safety in numbers, and that group gradually grows, and they begin to listen to what Lauren has to say on the subject of Earthseed. I really loved the description of the gradual fall. I am a sucker for the end of the world, as you know. And I really enjoyed Lauren as a character and the journey that she undertakes, both geographically, which was interesting, and in her own maturity and in her leadership, and as a prophet of this new religion. I enjoyed her hyper-empathy and the difficulties that creates, real practical problems. I felt really invested in the group's hopes and the perils that they encounter, and you're really rooting for them, I found. So I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading the follow-up, which is The Parable of the Talents. I give The Parable of the Sower 9 out of 10. It's a galactic gem. Next, in a total change of scene, is China Mountain Zhang by Maureen McHugh. And the premise of this book is a very interesting one. In this world, at some point in the 20th century, quite early on in the 20th century, capitalism was defeated as the dominant economic philosophy of the world, and instead Chinese Marxism became the leading philosophy. And that means that where we are in the 22nd century, all things Chinese are in the ascendance and have been for a long time. In the US, there's been a second American revolution, very much a socialist revolution, and even a cultural revolution to match the one in China in the 50s or 60s. In the main, Raphael Zhang is the protagonist. He's a young man, he's gay, and he's living in Brooklyn. And the fact that he's gay is not really a problem in the US, but in China it would be a real problem for him in terms of his progression. Fortunately for Raphael, he is half Chinese, half Hispanic, but he can pass as what's known as an ABC, or an American-born Chinese, and that provides him with some advantages. Interestingly, with this book, there's no plot as such, no through plot, and you could argue that nothing much really happens. It's more of an exploration, a series of glimpses of what life is like in this very different world that Maureen McHugh has conjured. She writes with a very painterly touch. I thought it was very vivid and interesting to read. To the extent that there is a plot, it's really a tale of the maturing of Raphael, a transition from drifting, underachieving, good for nothing, to a useful, successful member of society. And that story is fleshed out with other vignettes which follow different people with whom Raphael has a very peripheral encounter or two. I enjoyed the contrast between China, the centre of this interesting new world, where Raphael studied for a few years, and the America of this world, which is relatively unsophisticated in comparison. It's overcrowded and ravaged by the impacts of climate change, and generally quite old-fashioned in comparison. And for a book where nothing much really happens from a plot point of view, I was pulled along very nicely by Maureen McHugh's writing and the remarkable vision that she brings to life in this book. I enjoyed it very much. I give China Mountain Zhang 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next was Nina Allan's The Rift, and this is set partly in the 1990s and then about 20 years later. And this tells the story of two sisters, Selina, who's about 15 at the beginning of the book, and Julie, who's 17 or 18. They're living a fairly ordinary, mundane life in the suburbs somewhere. Their parents have a somewhat unhappy marriage. And then one day, Julie goes out and she's never seen again, presumed dead, in what becomes an unsolved police case, a cold case. There's grief, there's mourning, and there's the terrible pain of not knowing what's happened to their daughter or their sister. Each of the people in the rest of the family, that's Selina and her parents, handles it extremely differently, and Nina Allan does a great job of describing that. And then out of the blue, 20 years later, Julie phones Selina one day, sort of like, hi, and then Selina doesn't know what to think. But she's equal parts pissed off, relieved, and disbelieving. In their subsequent conversations, Julie tells of being transported via a rift in the space-time continuum to a planet called Tristane in a distant galaxy. And over the course of the book, Julie tells an extremely vivid story of her life on this planet, of the connections to her adopted family, which seemingly even predate her disappearance. There are also increasingly vivid hints of some trauma, and Selina comes to believe that Julie's story might just be a coping mechanism, a response, a symptom of some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. But if it is a delusion, it's a very carefully and fully formed delusion. This is a story about memory, what and how we remember. It's about belief, about trust, and about forgiveness. And it's about contradictory proof and conflicting evidence, and it's about which we choose to believe. It's about rifts, of course, between sisters, between parents, between mother and daughter, between the truth and fiction, between evidence and faith, and yes, maybe even in the space-time continuum. I really enjoyed the mosaic nature of the storytelling in The Rift. It's a bit of a puzzle in itself. Nina Allan jumps between narrators backwards and forwards in time and between Earth and life on Tristane. In fact, it's almost not a novel, it's almost mixed media. There are snippets of dialogue in play format. There are newspaper articles, diary entries, even police notebook extracts. And that might have been a bit of a mixed bag, a bit clumsy in the hands of a less capable writer, but I thought it worked really well. The world building in the elements set on Tristane is extremely vivid and richly drawn, including some literature and history to flesh it out, and is very well done. And it needs to be, to give Selina and others enough credible meat to doubt their instincts, to wonder if maybe this actually is true. Selina and Julia are extremely well drawn, but there's a supporting cast of characters that were equally well drawn, even if they didn't appear in the book for very long. I think she absolutely smashed the ending, finally nailing the contrast between evidence and faith, between love and doubt, and about what we choose to believe and why. I give The Rift a genuinely thought-provoking 8 out of 10. It's another stellar splendour. Next, I read The Engines of God by Jack McDevitt, and this was rather workaday. It's enjoyable but not memorable. Priscilla Hutchins, or Hutch to her friends, is effectively a space bus driver. She's a space transport pilot. But she's also an amateur xeno-archaeologist. On one of her transportation missions, she's with the scientists when they discover a statue of an alien on one of Saturn's moons. And other so-called monuments have been found on other planets with seemingly dead civilizations, including one called Karakwa. Hutch is tasked with taking another group of scientists to Karakwa, and their archaeology mission there comes into conflict pretty quickly with a terraforming project, which provides a bit of jeopardy and a ticking clock. Of course, as luck would have it, the scientists make a last-minute discovery, a vital discovery at that, and there is a race against time to beat the terraformers. And over the course of the rest of the book, it gets fairly bloody for various reasons, as the team try to unravel the mystery of the monument makers. I liked Hutch as a character, I might have a little crush on her, and there were some interesting aspects of the story. But generally it wasn't that compelling, to be honest, and I'm unsure that I'll continue on with the series, which currently has another 7 books, including a prequel. I haven't given up on Jack McDevitt entirely, though. I did enjoy his debut novel, The Hercules Text, much more than this one, I think, although that did have a lot more science and a lot less action. I give The Engines of God 6 out of 10. It's a nebulous narrative. Next on audiobook, I finished The Empire in Black and Gold by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and this is the first of what I think is a 10-book series known as The Shadows of the Apt. And this is firmly in the fantasy camp. It's not even remotely science fiction, but it came up with the Dice of Destiny, so what am I to do? Newsflash, I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. In this world, the people are one of many races, or of mixed race, where the races have an affinity with a particular insect. It might be a beetle, or a wasp, or grasshoppers, moths, mantis, ants, you name it. The wasps seem to be modelled somewhat on the Roman Empire, and they are on the march. Stemwold Maker is an elderly academic beetle-kinden with a more active past, and now also in secret a spy master. He foresees that the peaceful lowlands will soon be at the mercy of the wasp kingdom, who seem to be bent on world domination. But no one's listening, and he forms a ragtag band of agents to infiltrate the wasps and find more evidence. Tchaikovsky does such a good job of describing the various insect-kinden that it's actually difficult to remember that they are in fact just people. They're not actual insects. They do have some characteristics in common, but they are just people. I like the world building, and I was invested in the core characters, who are mostly young people in over their heads, but overcoming the challenges that life throws at them. We get to know each of them a little bit better in this first book, and we get flashbacks to Stenwald and his mantis friends Tisamon's military past. I felt like the Wasp Kingdom were a little bit wooden as enemies. They were rather obvious baddies, although I thought that Captain Thalric was a bit more three-dimensional. I give Empire in Black and Gold an enjoyable 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next is The Wanderer by Fritz Leiber, and we're all minding our own business when out of nowhere a giant purple and yellow planet appears, and it starts to eat the moon, and its gravitational effects begin to create havoc back on Earth. There are earthquakes, there are volcanoes, there are tidal waves, floods, and in some places all of the above. We follow a bunch of different characters, many of them I think rather extraneous to the plot. But the main bunch are a scientist and an astronaut's girlfriend and her cat, who get caught up with some flying saucer nuts whose wildest dreams have been emphatically fulfilled with the arrival of the Wanderer. The interactions with the denizens of the Wanderer are handled by one moon-based astronaut and one scientist who gets sucked up into one of their flying saucers. Is it a first contact story? Is it a disaster movie? Is it a post-apocalyptic survival tale? Is it alien invasion? And it's a bit of all of the above, it turns out. I found it to be overlong, with too many fringe characters who only seem to exist to provide examples of the extreme effects of the Wanderer's arrival. Even the perky cat lady on the cover doesn't appear until halfway through. There is an amusing case of mistaken identity involving a pet cat, and I did like the disastery elements. I do like a good disaster, but the rest of it left me a bit cold, I'm afraid. As a result, I give The Wanderer 6 out of 10. It's a nebulous narrative. All of which means that Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower is my book of the month for November 2024. Which of these books have you read? Do let me know in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.